The star system of New Meridian sat quietly on the edge of known space, far from the crowded core worlds, where 100 different species argued, traded, and lived side by side. It was not a rich system. It had no rare metals, no ancient ruins, no strategic value that would make anyone fight over it. What it had was a hospital, and that hospital was famous across half the galaxy. The hospital was called Solace Station. It floated in orbit above the blue-green planet of New Meridian, a huge ring of white metal and glass that caught the light of the system's yellow sun. Ships from a dozen different worlds docked there every day. Humans, Vakari, Doran, Ashtani, and even a few Kryzeth traders came to Solace Station when they were sick or hurt, because the doctors there did not ask which flag you flew before they helped you. That was the rule, written into the station's founding charter more than 80 years ago. Every patient, regardless of species, nation, or history, would be treated with equal care. This rule mattered more than most people realized. 107 years ago, the galaxy had been a very different place. Humanity had been a young species then, newly arrived on the galactic stage, and the Kryzeth Imperium had decided that Earth and its colonies would make a fine addition to their empire. The Kryzeth were an old species, proud and powerful, with fleets that had conquered a dozen star systems before they ever met a human. They expected an easy war. They did not get one. Humans fought back with everything they had. They were not as advanced as the Kryzeth. Their ships were slower, their weapons weaker, their numbers smaller. But humans had something the Kryzeth did not expect, an unwillingness to lose, and a strange, terrifying creativity in how they fought. They mined asteroid fields and turned empty freighters into weapons. They fought in the mud of their own colonies rather than surrender them. They built things faster than anyone thought possible, learned from every defeat, and kept coming back. The war lasted 11 years and cost millions of lives on both sides. In the end, the Kryzeth Imperium signed a peace treaty rather than keep paying the price of trying to break humanity's will. That treaty was still remembered, 107 years later. It had shaped everything about how humans dealt with the rest of the galaxy. After the war, human leaders made a promise to themselves and to every other species watching. Humanity would never again start a war. They had seen what war cost, and they had decided that peace, however hard to keep, was worth protecting. Human diplomats became known across the galaxy for patience. Human traders became known for fairness, and human doctors, on stations like Solace, became known for a kind of quiet, stubborn kindness that treated every wounded person the same way, friend or former enemy. Dr. Elena Voss had worked on Solace Station for almost 12 years. She was human, born on a colony world called Meridian Prime, just a few light years away, and she had chosen to study medicine instead of anything else, because her grandmother, a veteran of the old war, had once told her that healing was the bravest thing a person could do after a war. Elena believed that. She had spent her whole career proving it, treating patients from species that had once tried to kill her ancestors, because she believed the peace was worth more than old grudges. On the morning this story truly begins, Elena was walking through the station's main ward, checking on patients before her shift ended. The ward was full that day. A young Vakari boy with a broken wing rested near the window, watching the stars. An elderly Doran woman recovered from surgery in the next bed, her 4 eyes closed in sleep. A human miner from a nearby asteroid colony sat up in bed, laughing with a nurse about something that had happened before his accident. It was, in every way, an ordinary day. Elena did not know that her ordinary day was about to become the last ordinary day for a very long time. Far beyond the edges of the New Meridian system, something was moving through the dark. It was not supposed to be there. According to every treaty signed after the Old War, this part of space belonged to no one. A buffer zone, meant to keep the Kryzeth Imperium and the human colonies safely apart. But in recent years, the Imperium had changed. The old emperor, the one who had signed the peace treaty a century ago, was long dead. His descendants had grown restless, hungry for the territory their ancestors had lost. A new faction had risen inside the Imperium's court, one that saw the peace treaty not as a wise decision, but as a humiliating defeat that needed to be undone. This faction called itself the Void Guard, and it had spent the last decade quietly building ships, training soldiers, and waiting for the right moment to strike. Their leader, a general named Threxus Khan, believed that humanity had grown soft during a century of peace. He believed the old stories of human ferocity were exaggerated, the kind of tales that grow taller with every retelling. He believed that a single, decisive strike against a human world would prove that the Imperium could take back everything the old Emperor had given away, and that humanity, faced with real force, would simply back down the way any reasonable, peaceful species would. General Khan was wrong about many things, but on this particular morning, as his fleet moved silently through the buffer zone toward New Meridian, he did not yet know how wrong he was. Back on Solace Station, Elena finished her rounds and stopped by the observation deck, a quiet room with wide windows that looked out over the stars. She liked to come here at the end of her shift, before heading home to sleep. It helped her clear her mind. Today, the stars looked the same as they always did, calm and distant and endless. She had no way of knowing that somewhere out there, ships loaded with weapons were closing in on her home. Elsewhere in the galaxy, on Earth's capital world, the Unified Human Council was holding its usual weekly session. General Marcus Reyes, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with gray hair and old scars from the war he had fought as a young soldier, sat quietly through a discussion about trade routes and colony budgets. He had fought in the old war against the Kryzeth Imperium as a teenager, one of the last soldiers still serving who remembered what that war had actually been like. Now he served on the council as a military advisor, a job he took seriously even when the meetings were boring. Reyes did not think about the war much anymore. It had been over a century, and he had spent most of his life since then, working to make sure it never happened again. He believed in the peace. He had buried friends because of that war, and he did not want any other soldier to go through what he had gone through. But sometimes, in quiet moments, an old feeling stirred in him, a soldier's instinct that refused to fully rest. Today, sitting in the council chamber, he felt that instinct stir without knowing why. He would understand why, very soon. 300 light-years away, near the edge of the buffer zone, a small human patrol ship named the Vigilant Star picked up strange readings on its long-range sensors. The ship's young captain, a woman named Sarah Cade, frowned at the data on her screen. Something large was moving through space that should have been empty. She tried to identify it, but the signal kept flickering in and out, as if something out there was actively trying to hide itself. Sarah sent a message back to Fleet Command, flagging the reading as unusual but not yet alarming. Ships passed through the buffer zone sometimes, usually traders who had lost their way or smugglers hoping to avoid taxes. It was probably nothing. It was not nothing. Behind the flickering sensor ghost, General Khan's fleet continued forward, engines running quiet, weapons systems already warming up. His target was not a military base or a shipyard. He had chosen something else entirely, something he believed would send an unmistakable message without provoking a full military response. He had chosen Solace Station. Khan believed that striking a hospital, while brutal, would be seen as a limited, almost symbolic act, a warning shot, meant to remind humanity of the Imperium's power without truly starting a war. He believed humans, so devoted to peace, would absorb the loss quietly, rather than risk everything they had built over a century. He believed a great many things that morning. Soon, every one of them would be tested, and every one of them would be found wrong. On Solace Station, Elena Voss left the observation deck and walked toward the transport bay to catch her ride home. She passed the young Vicari boy's room one more time, smiled at him through the window, and kept walking. She had no idea that in a few hours, everything she loved about this place, the calm ward, the laughing miner, the quiet promise of care for anyone who needed it, would be gone in a wall of fire. The long peace, 107 years old, was about to end. Nobody on Solace Station knew it yet, but far out in the dark, the ships were already coming. The attack came without warning, the way General Khan had planned it. His fleet dropped out of hidden space just beyond the edge of the New Meridian system, close enough to strike quickly, far enough to avoid the planet's outer defense sensors until it was too late to matter. 12 warships, sleek and dark, moved into position around Solace Station, like wolves circling a wounded animal. Khan stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dread Providence, watching the hospital station grow larger on the main screen. He told himself, one more time, that this was the right choice. A single strike, A message sent, nothing more. Elena Voss had just stepped off the transport shuttle taking her home when the first alarms began. She barely noticed them at first, distracted by her tired thoughts about sleep and food. Then the alarms grew louder, and the transport's pilot swore under his breath and turned the small ship around. Elena looked out the window and saw something that did not make sense. Warships, Kryzeth warships, unmistakable with their curved black hulls, sitting in orbit where no warships should have been. "That's not possible," the pilot muttered, already pushing the shuttle's engines to full power, heading back toward the station instead of away from it. Elena did not argue. Her friends, her patients, the sick and the wounded who could not run or hide, were all still on that station. On the bridge of the Dread Providence, General Khan gave the order. The Kryzeth warships opened fire on Solace Station's outer ring first, a calculated strike meant to disable its shields and defenses without immediately destroying the whole structure. Khan wanted the Imperium's power demonstrated, not a massacre broadcast across 1,000 worlds. But war, even a carefully planned one, rarely goes the way its planners imagine. The first volley tore through the station's shield generators exactly as intended. The second volley, meant to strike a communications tower on the outer ring, missed its mark by less than a kilometer. A small error, caused by a targeting glitch that no one would ever fully explain. That volley struck the main ward instead, the very room where Elena had walked her rounds that morning. The explosion ripped through 3 decks in seconds. Alarms screamed through what remained of the station's systems. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut, some too late, trapping doctors, nurses, and patients on the wrong side of the fire. The young Vakari boy with the broken wing, the elderly Doran woman recovering from surgery, the human miner who had been laughing with a nurse just hours before, all of them were caught in the chaos that followed. Khan watched the readouts on his bridge with a growing sense of unease. This was not the clean, limited strike he had planned. Fires were spreading through sections of the station that should not have been hit at all. His tactical officer reported casualties in numbers far higher than intended. Not soldiers, not military targets, but patients and medical staff, humans and aliens alike, caught in a disaster that was quickly spiraling beyond his control. "Ceasefire," Khan ordered, his voice tight. "Ceasefire immediately." The Kryzeth ships stopped their attack, but the damage was already done. Solace Station, once a symbol of peace between a dozen species, burned in orbit above New Meridian. Emergency shuttles and rescue ships from the planet below scrambled upward, racing against time and fire to save whoever they could. Elena's shuttle arrived just as the firing stopped. Through the window, she saw the wreckage, a whole section of the station torn open, spilling debris and bodies into the vacuum of space. She screamed at the pilot to get closer, to let her out, to do something, anything. The pilot, his hands shaking, guided the small shuttle toward a docking port that was somehow still intact. Inside the station, chaos reigned. Emergency lights flickered through smoke-filled corridors. Nurses dragged patients away from collapsed walls. A team of Ashtani doctors worked desperately to seal a hull breach with whatever material they could find, buying precious minutes for the evacuation teams still searching the wreckage. Elena ran through corridors she had walked 1,000 times, now unrecognizable, filled with fire and debris, and the sounds of people crying out for help. She found the young Vakari boy first, pinned beneath a collapsed support beam, his wings, already broken, now crushed further by the weight of the fallen ceiling. Elena worked with 2 other nurses to free him, ignoring the burns on her own hands from the hot metal. They pulled him free just as another section of the ceiling gave way behind them, missing them by only a few feet. Not everyone was so lucky. By the time rescue teams finished their search hours later, the numbers were staggering. Over 3,000 people had died in the attack, patients and staff from a dozen different species, including nearly 600 children who had been in the station's care ward for treatment of illnesses and injuries that had nothing to do with any war. Among the dead were 211 humans, 43 Vakari, 60 Doran, and dozens more from species scattered across the galaxy who had simply come to Solace Station because it was known as a place where anyone could find help. General Khan withdrew his fleet within the hour, retreating back across the buffer zone before any human military response could organize. He sent a message ahead to the Imperium's high command, a carefully worded statement calling the attack a tragic accident, a strike against what Kryzeth intelligence had mistakenly believed was a hidden human military installation. The message expressed regret for the loss of civilian life, while insisting that the Imperium bore no responsibility for what it called an unfortunate error in judgment made by field commanders acting without full information. Nobody who saw the wreckage of Solace Station believed that explanation, not for a moment. News of the attack spread across the galaxy within hours, carried by shocked survivors, horrified witnesses, and reporters who arrived to find a burning hospital station and a death toll that grew larger with every passing hour. Every major galactic news network carried the story. Species who had never had any connection to humanity or the old human Kryzeth War watched footage of the wreckage with horror. A hospital, of all places, a station built specifically to help anyone regardless of species or nation, had been struck by military weapons. The Galactic Council, the loose alliance of species that had governed peaceful relations between star nations for the past century, called an emergency session within a day of the attack. Representatives from a dozen worlds demanded answers from the Kryzeth Imperium's ambassador, who could offer little beyond the same carefully worded apology Khan's message had already provided. Many council members, while horrified, urged caution. Nobody wanted a full galactic war. The old human Kryzeth conflict, though a century past, was still remembered as one of the bloodiest wars in recent galactic history, and the idea of reigniting it, even in retaliation for something as terrible as this attack, filled many leaders with dread. On Earth, the reaction was different. There was no caution, no careful diplomatic language, only grief and a rising, dangerous anger. Elena Voss survived the attack, though her hands would carry burn scars for the rest of her life. She spent the following days working alongside emergency crews, helping identify the dead, comforting survivors, and trying to make sense of a tragedy that made no sense at all. She had believed, her whole life, in the promise Solace Station represented, that healing mattered more than old grudges, that peace was worth protecting, even when it was hard. Watching the wreckage of everything she had built her life around, she wondered, for the first time, if that belief had been naive. 300 light-years away, General Marcus Reyes received the news in the middle of the night, waking to an emergency call from Fleet Command. He listened to the report in silence, his old soldier's instincts, the ones that had stirred uneasily just days before without explanation, now fully awake and screaming at him that everything was about to change. He thought of the friends he had lost in the old war, the ones who had died believing they were fighting, so that no one would ever have to fight again. He thought of the peace treaty, 107 years old, that had held despite every test, every provocation, every moment of tension between humanity and the wider galaxy. He thought of Solace Station, a place he had visited once, years ago, and remembered as a symbol of everything that peace had made possible. Reyes got dressed in the dark and left for Fleet Command before the sun rose over his home. He had a feeling, deep in his gut, that the peace he had spent his whole adult life protecting was about to be tested in a way it had never been tested before. He was right. Within days, the Unified Human Council would gather for a vote that would decide whether humanity's long peace would survive, or whether, for the first time in 107 years, humanity would go to war. The Unified Human Council chamber on Earth had never been so full. Every seat was taken. Every representative from every colony and territory had traveled home or logged in remotely to attend what everyone already understood would be the most important vote of their lifetimes. Outside the chamber, crowds gathered in the streets of the capital, holding vigils for the dead of Solace Station, their candles and quiet grief, a stark contrast to the anger simmering just beneath the surface. General Marcus Reyes sat in his usual seat near the front of the chamber, but nothing about this session felt usual. He had spent the last 3 days reviewing every piece of intelligence Fleet Command could gather about the attack, cross-referencing sensor logs from the Vigilant Star, survivor testimonies from Solace Station, and the Kryzeth Imperium's official statements. The evidence was clear and damning. This had not been a mistake made by confused field commanders, as the Imperium claimed. Fleet analysts had identified General Khan's flagship among the attacking ships, and Khan was well known to human intelligence as the leader of the Void Guard faction, a group that had spent years openly advocating for renewed conflict with humanity. The council's session began with a moment of silence for the dead, over 3,000 names read aloud one by one, a process that took nearly 2 hours. Reyes listened to every name, feeling the weight of each one settle into the room like stone. By the time the reading finished, the chamber was heavy with grief, and heavier still, with a question nobody wanted to answer, but everybody knew they had to. Council Speaker Amara Chen, a small woman, with sharp eyes, and a reputation for careful, measured leadership, opened the debate. "We stand at a crossroads our ancestors hoped we would never face again," she said, her voice carrying through the silent chamber. 107 years ago, our people paid an unimaginable price to win the peace we have lived under ever since. That peace has allowed humanity to grow, to build, to become something more than survivors of a brutal war. Today we must decide whether that peace can survive what has happened, or whether we owe the dead of Solace Station a response that peace alone cannot provide. The debate that followed lasted nearly 14 hours. Reyes listened to council member after council member rise to speak, some arguing passionately for restraint, others for immediate and overwhelming retaliation. He understood both sides more than most people in the room. He had fought in the old war. He knew, in a way most of the younger council members could never fully understand, exactly what war cost. Councilman Aldrich Voss rose partway through the session, his voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. Aldrich was Elena Voss's father, a retired teacher who had never sought political office until 3 years ago, when a local council seat opened, and his neighbors convinced him to run. Nobody in the chamber had known, until this moment, that his daughter had survived the attack on Solace Station. "My daughter was there," Aldrich said, and the chamber went completely silent. "She survived. Many of her friends did not. I have spent my whole life believing in peace, believing that violence only creates more violence, that the cycle must end somewhere. I still believe that, but I also believe that peace built on cowardice is not peace at all. It is only fear wearing peace's clothing. If we do nothing now, if we allow the murder of thousands of innocent people to go unanswered, what peace are we actually protecting? A peace that permits this to happen again. Whenever the Kryzeth Imperium decides another message needs sending." His words landed hard in the chamber. Several council members who had been leaning toward restraint visibly reconsidered their positions. Aldrich sat back down, his hands shaking, and Reyes felt something shift in the room. A tipping point approaching that everyone could sense, but no one had yet named aloud. Councilwoman Priya Nakamura, one of the strongest voices for restraint, rose next. She reminded the chamber of the cost of the old war, the 11 years of fighting, the millions of lives lost on both sides, the generations it had taken to rebuild what had been destroyed. "I do not say this because I do not grieve," she said. "I grieve as much as anyone in this room. But grief is not strategy, and anger is not wisdom. If we declare war, we risk becoming the very thing we fought so hard to stop being 107 years ago. We risk turning humanity's name into something the galaxy fears instead of respects." Reyes understood her fear. He had felt it himself, many times, in the years since the old war ended. But sitting in that chamber, listening to the names of the dead still echoing in his memory, he found himself standing to speak, something he had not planned to do. "I fought in the old war," he said, and the chamber quieted to listen to one of the last living veterans of that conflict. "I was 17 years old when the Kryzeth Imperium first attacked a human colony, and I watched people I loved die in that war. I have spent the last 90 years of my life working to make sure no one else has to go through what I went through. I believe in peace. I have given my whole life to it." He paused, letting the weight of his history settle over the room. But peace is not the absence of war. Peace is a promise, kept by both sides, that violence will not be used to settle disagreements. The Kryzeth Imperium broke that promise 3 days ago, in the cruelest way imaginable, by striking a hospital, a place built specifically to help anyone, regardless of nation or history. If we do not respond, we are not choosing peace. We are simply choosing to let the promise be broken without consequence, and inviting it to be broken again. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of council members who had fought for restraint, and those who had fought for retaliation alike. I do not say this lightly, and I do not say it with anger. I say it because I believe it is true. Sometimes the only way to protect peace is to prove that breaking it carries a cost too high for anyone to pay again. The chamber fell silent after he sat down. Speaker Chen called for a short recess before the final vote, giving council members time to reflect on everything they had heard. Reyes used the time to step outside the chamber, into a quiet hallway where he could think. He found Aldrich Voss there too, sitting alone on a bench, his head in his hands. "Your daughter," Reyes said quietly, sitting down beside him. "Is she all right?" Aldrich looked up, his eyes red. "Her hands are burned. She won't talk about what she saw in there. She keeps saying she should have done more, saved more people. She was a doctor helping the wounded, and somehow she still feels like she failed." Reyes nodded slowly. "That's how it goes, sometimes. The ones who survive carry a weight the dead don't have to carry anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "I fought so that no one would have to feel what your daughter is feeling right now. I still believe in that fight, but I think, sometimes, protecting peace means being willing to defend it, not just hope it holds on its own." Aldrich said nothing, but he nodded, and the two men sat together in silence until the recess ended, and it was time to return to the chamber for the final vote. The vote itself took only a few minutes, though it felt to Reyes like it stretched on far longer. Council members cast their votes one by one, some quickly and firmly, others hesitating, clearly still wrestling with the weight of the decision, even as they made it. Reyes watched the counter on the main display climb, side by side, the numbers for restraint and the numbers for retaliation, rising almost evenly at first, then slowly tipping toward one side as the final votes came in. When the counting finished, Speaker Chen read the result aloud, her voice steady, despite the enormity of what she was announcing. The council had voted, by a solid though not overwhelming majority, to formally declare war against the Kryzeth Imperium's Void Guard faction, and any Imperial forces supporting it. The first declaration of war humanity had issued in 107 years. The chamber did not erupt into cheers, as war declarations in old stories sometimes did. Instead, a heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by quiet murmurs and, from some corners, quiet weeping. This was not a celebration. It was a recognition that something irreversible had just happened, that the long peace humanity had protected for over a century had finally, tragically, come to an end. Reyes stood as the session closed, feeling the old soldier's instinct inside him settle into something familiar and grim: purpose. He thought of the names read aloud at the start of the session, of Elena Voss's burned hands, of General Khan's fleet retreating into the dark after leaving Solace Station in flames. Humanity had chosen peace for 107 years. Now, for the first time in generations, humanity would go to war, not to conquer, not to expand, but to answer a promise broken, and to make certain it would never be broken so easily again. Across the galaxy, the news of humanity's declaration spread within hours, and in council chambers and command centers on 1,000 worlds, leaders who remembered stories of the old war, or had heard them told by their grandparents, felt a familiar chill settle over them. The sleeping giant, quiet for over a century, was waking up. Within an hour of the council's declaration, every human shipyard across every colony world received the same order: begin full wartime production immediately. It had been over a century since those words had last been spoken, but the systems built to carry them out had never been fully dismantled. Humanity, true to its cautious nature, had kept its old wartime infrastructure quietly maintained, mothballed but functional, tucked away in case a day like this ever came. Nobody had truly believed it would. Now, all across human space, that old infrastructure groaned awake. At the massive shipyards orbiting Mars, Chief Engineer Tobias Wren received the activation order in the middle of a routine maintenance shift. He read it twice, certain there had been some mistake, before the second confirmation came through, signed personally by the Fleet Admiral. Tobias had grown up hearing stories from his grandfather about the old war, stories of shipyards working around the clock, of entire cities converting their factories to build warships instead of consumer goods. He had never expected to live through something like that himself, Within 6 hours, the shipyards around Mars had switched entirely to wartime production schedules. Workers who had been building passenger transports and cargo haulers found themselves reassigned to warship construction lines instead, guided by engineers who had trained for exactly this scenario during peacetime drills that most had assumed were just bureaucratic exercises. It turned out those drills had not been wasted after all. Across human space, similar scenes played out. Colony worlds that had spent a century focused on agriculture, mining, and manufacturing for civilian markets pivoted almost overnight toward military production. It was not a smooth transition, and there were mistakes, delays, and confusion in the first days. But humanity had learned something important during the Old War, over a century ago, and had never forgotten it. Adaptability mattered more than perfection. Get something working, then improve it, move fast, fail small, fix quickly, and never stop moving. Far beyond human space, the rest of the galaxy watched this transformation with a mixture of fear and fascination. On the Vakari homeworld, a species known for their careful diplomacy and long institutional memory, Ambassador Threll Kaith sat in her office, reviewing intelligence reports about humanity's mobilization. The Vakari had fought alongside humanity briefly during the Old War, providing medical support and intelligence sharing after Kryzeth forces had raided several Vakari trade routes. Threll remembered the stories her grandmother, one of the Vakari diplomats who had worked closely with human leaders during that conflict, used to tell about what humanity had been like at war. They do not fight like other species, her grandmother had told her, many years ago. Other species fight to win a battle. Humans fight to win a war, and they treat every battle, every resource, every mistake, as a lesson to be used in the next fight. They are exhausting to fight alongside, because they never stop working, never stop adapting, never stop building. But I would rather have them as allies than enemies, every single time. Threll had never fully understood what her grandmother meant, until now, watching intelligence reports of human shipyards working at speeds that seemed almost impossible, watching human engineers develop new ship designs in weeks that would have taken other species years to approve through their bureaucracies. She drafted a formal message to the Vakari Council, recommending that Vakari Space quietly open its supply lines to human forces, providing raw materials and logistical support without officially declaring involvement in the conflict. She suspected, based on everything she was seeing, that humanity would not need much help winning this war. But she wanted the Vakari to be remembered, when this was over, as a species that had stood beside humanity, rather than watched from a safe distance. On a Doran trading station near the buffer zone, an old merchant named Vosh Kalidar watched news reports of humanity's mobilization with a different kind of attention. Vosh had lost his youngest son in the Solace Station attack, a young engineer who had been visiting the hospital for treatment of a chronic illness that had nothing to do with any war. Vosh had spent the days since the attack in a fog of grief, barely eating, barely sleeping. But watching the reports of human shipyards converting to wartime production gave him something he had not felt since the attack. A small, grim sense of hope that his son's death would not go unanswered. He was not alone. Across a dozen species and 100 worlds, families who had lost loved ones at Solace Station watched humanity's mobilization with similar feelings. Grief mixed with something that was not quite satisfaction, but was close to it. A sense that someone, finally, was going to make the Kryzeth Imperium's Void Guard faction answer for what they had done. Not everyone watched with hope, however. On several worlds that had maintained careful neutrality throughout the old human Kryzeth War, leaders watched humanity's mobilization with growing concern. The Ashtani Assembly, a species known for strict pacifism and careful avoidance of any conflict, issued a formal statement expressing hope that humanity's response would remain proportional and restrained, a diplomatic way of asking humanity not to go too far. Assembly leaders remembered stories of the old war's brutality, and while they mourned the loss of Ashtani citizens at Solace Station as deeply as anyone, they feared what a fully mobilized humanity might do if given free rein to pursue vengeance rather than justice. General Marcus Reyes understood these concerns better than most. In the days following the declaration of war, he found himself in dozens of meetings, briefing Fleet Command on strategy, while also fielding questions from nervous diplomats representing species worried about how far humanity's response might go. He gave the same answer every time. Humanity's goal was not conquest, not revenge for its own sake, but accountability. The Void Guard faction that had ordered the attack on Solace Station needed to be stopped and held responsible. The war would end the moment that goal was achieved, not one day sooner or later. Not everyone in human leadership fully agreed with him, and Reyes knew it. There were voices in the military and in the council who wanted a harsher response, who argued that decades of restraint had allowed the Void Guard faction to grow bold enough to attack a hospital in the first place, and that only a devastating, unmistakable show of force would prevent future attacks. Reyes disagreed, but he understood the anger behind those voices. He had felt it himself, in quieter moments, thinking about the names read aloud in the council chamber. Meanwhile, human military training centers across every colony world filled with volunteers within days of the declaration. Young people who had grown up hearing stories about the old war from grandparents and history teachers, but who had never expected to fight in one themselves, showed up in numbers that surprised even the most optimistic recruitment projections. Among them was a young woman named Mira Torres, a colonist from a farming world near the edge of human space, who had lost her cousin in the attack on Solace Station. She had never considered military service before, content with her quiet life working her family's fields. Now she stood in line at a recruitment center with hundreds of others, waiting to sign up for training that would take her far from home and, quite possibly, into danger she could barely imagine. "Why are you doing this?" the recruiter asked her, a standard question asked of every volunteer to make sure they understood what they were signing up for. Mira thought about her cousin, about the stories her grandfather used to tell about the old war, about the strange, heavy silence that had fallen over her home colony since the news of Solace Station broke. "Because someone has to answer for what happened," she said finally, "and because I don't want my children, someday, to have to answer for it instead of me." The recruiter nodded and processed her enlistment. Across human space, thousands of similar conversations played out every day. Ordinary people choosing to become soldiers, not because they wanted war, but because they believed, as Mira did, that some things could not simply be allowed to pass without response. Within 2 weeks of the Council's declaration, humanity's military had grown from a modest peacetime defense force into something far larger and more capable, though still, by galactic standards, relatively small compared to the vast fleets maintained by the Kryzeth Imperium. What humanity lacked in raw numbers, however, it made up for in something harder to measure: the same fierce adaptability and refusal to quit that had won the old war a century earlier, now combined with technology and resources far more advanced than anything available during that first terrible conflict. General Khan, watching intelligence reports of humanity's rapid mobilization from his command post deep within Kryzeth territory, felt his earlier confidence beginning to waver, though he refused to admit it to his subordinates. He had expected humanity to hesitate, to debate endlessly, to eventually settle for diplomatic protests and economic sanctions rather than open war. Instead, he was watching an entire species convert itself into a war machine with a speed and determination that unsettled even his most experienced officers. "They are only human," Khan told his staff, repeating words he had said many times before the attack. "One species, spread thin across a handful of colonies. Whatever fleet they build, our numbers will overwhelm them." His staff nodded in agreement, as staff officers often do when their commander speaks with confidence. But privately, several of them had begun studying old records of the first human Kryzeth War more carefully than they had in years, searching for any clue about what, exactly, humanity might be capable of when truly provoked. They would not have long to wait for their answer. Within a month of the declaration of war, humanity's first strike fleet would be ready to launch, and the galaxy would begin to learn, once again, exactly what happened when the sleeping giant woke up. The human strike fleet gathered at the edge of the buffer zone, under the command of Fleet Admiral Yuki Tanaka, a career officer who had spent 30 years preparing for a war she had hoped would never come. Her flagship, the Resolute Dawn, led a formation of 83 warships, smaller in number than a typical Kryzeth battle fleet, but faster, more heavily armed relative to their size, and crewed by soldiers and officers who understood exactly why they were fighting. Admiral Tanaka had studied General Khan's Void Guard faction extensively In the weeks since the attack on Solus Station, human intelligence had identified 3 primary Void Guard shipyards and 2 major fleet staging areas within striking distance, all located just inside Kryzeth territory near the buffer zone. Rather than launching a broad, overwhelming assault against the entire Imperium, which risked drawing in Kryzeth forces loyal to the more moderate factions of the Imperial Court, Tanaka's strategy focused narrowly on Void Guard military infrastructure. The goal was precision, not devastation. Cripple the Void Guard's ability to wage war, without giving the wider Imperium a reason to fully unite against humanity. "We are not here to conquer," Tanaka told her assembled officers before the fleet launched its first strike. "We are here to make sure the people who ordered the attack on Solus Station can never do something like that again. Every target we hit should serve that purpose. Nothing more." The first target was a Void Guard shipyard, orbiting a barren moon, called Threxus Minor, named after the same ancient Kryzeth war hero, whose name General Khan had taken as his own honorific years earlier. The shipyard was heavily defended, protected by orbital weapon platforms and a rotating garrison fleet, but Khan's forces, confident in their numbers, had not expected humanity to strike so quickly or so precisely. Human forces arrived at Threxus Minor, using a tactic borrowed and refined from the old war: staggered, coordinated strikes, designed to overwhelm point defenses faster than they could adapt. Rather than approaching as a single-massed fleet, easy to target and predict, Tanaka's ships split into a dozen smaller strike groups, approaching from multiple vectors simultaneously, guided by real-time data shared instantly across the entire fleet, through communication systems Kryzeth engineers had not anticipated humans possessing. The Kryzeth garrison fleet at Threxus Minor scrambled to respond, but the coordination and speed of the human attack overwhelmed their defenses within the first 20 minutes of engagement. Human fighter squadrons, flown by pilots who had trained relentlessly during the weeks of mobilization, tore through Kryzeth interceptor formations, with tactics that seemed almost unpredictable, constantly shifting formations, using decoy signals, and striking from angles Kryzeth combat doctrine did not anticipate. Captain Sarah Cade, the young officer whose patrol ship had first detected the strange sensor readings before the attack on Solus Station, now commanded one of the human strike groups at Threxus Minor. She had requested a combat assignment immediately after the declaration of war, driven by a mixture of guilt for not flagging the original sensor reading as more urgent, and a fierce determination to make sure nothing like Solus Station happened again. Her strike group targeted the shipyard's primary construction docks, systematically disabling the facilities used to build and repair Void Guard warships, without destroying the docks entirely, in keeping with Tanaka's strategy of crippling capability, rather than causing unnecessary destruction. "Command wants this shipyard offline, not obliterated," Sarah reminded her crew as they moved into position. "Precision hits on the construction bays and power systems. Keep collateral damage as low as possible." Her crew executed the strike with careful discipline, targeting exactly the systems Fleet Command had identified as critical to the shipyard's function. Within 2 hours, Threxus Minor's shipyard had been rendered completely inoperable, its construction docks disabled, its power systems offline, without a single strike against the facility's living quarters or the workers stationed there. Sarah made sure of that personally, reviewing targeting data herself before authorizing any strike near populated sections of the facility. The Kryzeth defenders, expecting a battle of annihilation, similar to stories they had heard about the old human Kryzeth war, found themselves instead facing something stranger and, in some ways, more unsettling. An enemy fighting with terrifying skill and coordination, yet deliberately avoiding maximum destruction. It did not fit the picture General Khan had painted of humans as brutal, vengeful aggressors lashing out without restraint. It looked, disturbingly, like a species fighting with purpose and discipline, exactly the kind of enemy the old stories had warned about. Similar engagements played out at the other targeted Void Guard facilities. At a fleet staging area near the border world of Keswick Reach, human forces intercepted and disabled nearly 40% of a gathering Void Guard battle fleet before it could even leave dock, using long-range strikes coordinated with intelligence, gathered from allied Vakari sensor networks, that Ambassador Threll Kaith had quietly arranged access to in the weeks following her recommendation to the Vakari Council. At a third target, a research facility developing new weapons technology for the Void Guard faction, human special operations teams boarded the facility directly, disabling its systems and extracting critical research data before Kryzeth reinforcements could arrive. General Khan received reports of these engagements throughout the day with growing alarm. He had expected humanity to take months, perhaps longer, to organize any meaningful military response. Instead, within 6 weeks of the attack on Solace Station, human forces had struck 3 major Void Guard facilities simultaneously, disabling significant portions of his faction's military infrastructure with a precision and coordination that unsettled him deeply. How is this possible? Khan demanded of his staff, reviewing damage reports from Threxus Minor with a mixture of anger and disbelief. We have 3 times their fleet strength. Our technology is comparable, in many areas superior. How are they striking with such precision? His intelligence officer, a cautious Kryzeth analyst named Vex Orin, hesitated before answering. General, I have been reviewing the old war records more closely since the attack on Solace Station. The historical accounts describe exactly this kind of engagement: precise, coordinated, adaptive. Humans do not fight the way our doctrine expects an enemy to fight. They study every engagement, adapt within hours, sometimes minutes, and coordinate their forces in ways our own command structure struggles to match. Khan dismissed the analysis with visible frustration. Unwilling to accept that his careful plans had underestimated an enemy he still considered fundamentally inferior. But privately, doubt had begun to creep into his confidence, a doubt he would not fully acknowledge until it was far too late to change course. Word of humanity's opening campaign spread quickly across the galaxy, carried by news networks eager to cover the first major conflict in over a century. What struck many observers, across a dozen species watching the reports, was not simply humanity's military effectiveness, but the deliberate restraint shown throughout the campaign. Human forces had struck military targets with devastating precision, while consistently avoiding civilian casualties, a stark contrast to the attack on Solace Station that had started the war in the first place. The Ashtani Assembly, which had expressed concern weeks earlier about humanity's response remaining proportional and restrained, issued a follow-up statement, acknowledging that human military operations had, so far, demonstrated exactly the kind of restraint they had hoped for. It was a small thing, but it mattered, shifting the tone of galactic opinion increasingly in humanity's favor, even as the fighting continued. On Earth, General Marcus Reyes followed the reports from Fleet Command with cautious relief. The opening campaign had gone better than even his most optimistic projections, but he knew better than most that early success in war rarely guaranteed how the rest of a conflict would unfold. He thought of General Khan, whose military record he had studied extensively in the weeks leading up to the war, and wondered how a commander so confident in his own superiority would respond to his first real taste of unexpected defeat. He did not have to wonder for long. Reports soon arrived indicating that General Khan, humiliated by the losses at Threxus Minor and Keswick Reach, was preparing a massive counterattack, gathering the full strength of his remaining Void Guard fleet for a decisive engagement he believed would finally prove human military capability had been wildly overestimated by his own analysts. Reyes reviewed the intelligence reports carefully, feeling that same old soldier's instinct stirring inside him once again. Khan's coming counterattack, he suspected, would be the true test of everything humanity had built during its long century of peace. The opening strikes had gone well, better than expected. But the real battle, the one that would determine whether the Void Guard faction could be truly stopped, was still ahead. Far across the buffer zone, at a heavily fortified Kryzeth staging point near a system called Vantis Hold, General Khan gathered the largest fleet the Void Guard faction had ever assembled, preparing to meet the human forces in the kind of overwhelming, decisive battle he was certain would finally crush their resistance and restore the natural order he believed had been disrupted a century too soon. He did not yet understand that he was about to make the same mistake his ancestors had made, 107 years earlier, underestimating exactly how far humanity would go and exactly how well humanity would fight, when the peace it valued so highly had finally, truly, been broken. General Khan assembled his fleet at Vantis Hold over the course of 10 days, gathering every warship the Void Guard faction could still field after the losses at Threxus Minor and Keswick Reach. When the fleet finally stood ready, it numbered nearly 200 vessels, more than double the size of Admiral Tanaka's strike force. Khan believed this overwhelming advantage in numbers would finally settle the matter, proving once and for all that the old stories of human military prowess had been exaggerated by a century of retelling. Human intelligence detected the buildup at Vantis Hold within days, thanks in part to sensor data shared quietly by Vicari networks along the border. Admiral Tanaka reviewed the reports with Fleet Command and General Reyes, who had traveled to the front lines personally to advise on the coming engagement. The numbers were sobering. Khan's fleet outnumbered human forces more than 2-1, and Vantis Hold's location gave the Void Guard fleet a significant defensive advantage, surrounded by asteroid fields and a dense debris ring left over from an ancient planetary collision, terrain that Kryzeth pilots had trained extensively to navigate. "He wants us to come to him," Reyes said, studying the tactical maps in Tanaka's command center aboard the Resolute Dawn. "He's chosen ground that favors his numbers and his pilot's familiarity with the terrain. A conventional engagement here would cost us dearly, even if we won." Tanaka nodded, already working through alternatives with her staff. "Then we don't give him a conventional engagement." Over the following days, human forces developed a strategy built on the same principles that had guided the opening strikes of the war: adaptability, unconventional tactics, and a willingness to accept short-term risk in service of a decisive advantage. Tanaka's staff studied the asteroid field and debris ring surrounding Vantis Hold extensively, identifying patterns in the debris movement that Kryzeth defenses, confident in their terrain advantage, had not accounted for. The plan that emerged was audacious, even risky. Rather than approaching Vantis Hold directly, where Khan's fleet waited in strong defensive positions, a portion of the human fleet would maneuver through the debris ring itself, using the same terrain Kryzeth pilots considered their advantage as cover for a surprise flanking attack. It was a dangerous maneuver, requiring precise navigation through unpredictable debris fields at combat speeds. But human pilots had spent the weeks since mobilization training extensively in exactly this kind of high-risk, high-precision flying. Captain Sarah Cade, whose strike group had performed exceptionally well at Threxis Minor, volunteered to lead the flanking force through the debris ring. She spent 3 days running simulations with her pilots, mapping the safest paths through the field, while accounting for the constant, chaotic movement of debris caused by the system's unstable gravitational currents. "This is going to be close," she told her pilots during their final briefing before the battle. "We'll be flying through terrain that could tear our ships apart if we make even one wrong move. But if we can get through, we come out behind their fleet, exactly where they won't expect us." The battle at Vantis Hold began when Admiral Tanaka's main fleet approached from the expected direction, drawing the bulk of Khan's forces into a defensive formation exactly as his strategy anticipated. Khan watched the human fleet's approach from his flagship with growing confidence, certain that the numerical advantage his forces held would prove decisive once the two fleets fully engaged. "They come to us after all," Khan told his staff, a note of satisfaction in his voice. As predicted, prepare to engage at full strength. The initial engagement unfolded largely as Khan expected, his numerical superiority allowing his fleet to press an advantage against Tanaka's smaller force. Human ships fought with the same skill and coordination they had demonstrated throughout the war's opening weeks, but the sheer difference in numbers began to tell as the battle progressed, and several human vessels sustained serious damage under the weight of concentrated Kryzeth fire. For nearly 40 minutes, the battle hung in careful balance, Tanaka's forces holding their position through skillful maneuvering and coordinated defense, but slowly losing ground against Khan's overwhelming numbers. It was, by any conventional measure, a battle humanity appeared to be losing. Then Captain Cade's flanking force emerged from the debris ring. Khan's fleet, fully committed to the engagement with Tanaka's main force, had left its rear flank almost entirely undefended, confident that no enemy force could navigate the treacherous debris field at combat speeds without suffering catastrophic losses. Cade's pilots proved that confidence badly misplaced. Emerging from the debris ring in tight, coordinated formation, her strike group struck the rear of Khan's fleet with devastating precision, targeting command ships and coordination vessels first, exactly the kind of high-value targets capable of disrupting the entire Void Guard formation's ability to communicate and adapt. The sudden attack threw Khan's fleet into chaos. Ships that had been pressing their advantage against Tanaka's main force suddenly found themselves caught between two engagements, their formation disrupted, their communication systems struggling to coordinate a response to an attack they had never anticipated. Khan, watching the battle unfold from his flagship, felt his earlier confidence crumble as reports of the flanking attack reached his bridge. "Impossible," he muttered, staring at tactical displays showing his fleet's rear formation collapsing under Cade's assault. No one could navigate that debris field at combat speed. But someone had, and the consequences were already unfolding across the battlefield. With Khan's fleet formation disrupted and several key command ships disabled by the flanking attack, Admiral Tanaka's main force pressed their own advantage, exploiting the chaos to target vulnerable sections of the Kryzeth fleet that had previously been protected by tight, coordinated formation. What had begun as a battle humanity appeared to be losing transformed, within the span of less than an hour, into a decisive engagement turning heavily in human favor. Khan attempted to reorganize his forces, ordering a fighting withdrawal that might preserve enough of his fleet to regroup and fight another day. But the damage had already been done. By the time the battle ended, nearly 60% of the Void Guard fleet had been destroyed or disabled, a catastrophic loss that shattered the faction's ability to wage further offensive operations. Human losses, while significant, remained far lower than Khan's forces had inflicted, a testament to the effectiveness of Tanaka's unconventional strategy. General Khan's flagship, the Dread Providence, sustained heavy damage during the fighting withdrawal but managed to escape the battle, retreating deeper into Kryzeth territory with the shattered remains of his once mighty fleet. The defeat at Vantis Hold marked a turning point in the war, not simply because of the military losses the Void Guard faction suffered, but because of what those losses revealed to the wider Kryzeth Imperium. News of the defeat spread quickly through Imperial court circles, carried by officers and analysts who had, until now, largely accepted Khan's confident assurances that human military capability had been vastly overestimated. The scale of the loss at Vantis Hold, combined with growing evidence of the Void Guard faction's responsibility for the original attack on Solace Station, began shifting opinion within the Imperial court against Khan and his faction. Emperor Threxus Vol, the current ruler of the Kryzeth Imperium, and a distant descendant of the emperor who had signed the original peace treaty with humanity a century earlier, had remained largely uninvolved in the Void Guard faction's activities, viewing Khan's aggressive posturing with private skepticism, even as he allowed the faction to operate with significant autonomy. The defeat at Vantis Hold, and the mounting evidence of Void Guard responsibility for the Solace Station attack, forced the emperor to finally take direct action, convening an emergency session of the Imperial Court to address what had become an increasingly untenable political situation. Meanwhile, other galactic powers who had watched the war's opening months with cautious neutrality began quietly reconsidering their positions. The Vakari Council, encouraged by Ambassador Threl Kaith's earlier recommendations and impressed by humanity's demonstrated restraint and effectiveness throughout the campaign, authorized expanded intelligence sharing and logistical support for human forces. Several smaller species along the border, who had lost citizens in the Solace Station attack, began offering similar quiet assistance, providing supply routes and sensor coverage that further strengthened humanity's strategic position. On Earth, news of the victory at Vantis Hold arrived to a complicated mixture of relief and continued grief. General Reyes, reviewing final casualty reports from the battle, felt the familiar weight of loss even amid clear victory, remembering all too well from his own experience in the Old War that no battle, however successful, came without cost. He thought of the pilots, who had not returned from Cade's daring flanking maneuver, of the crews lost aboard damaged human vessels during the fighting, and of the long road that still lay ahead before this war could truly be brought to an end. Captain Sarah Cade, exhausted but alive after leading the flanking attack that had turned the tide of the battle, received word shortly after the engagement that her actions at Vantis Hold had likely saved the entire human fleet from a costly, possibly even disastrous defeat. She felt no particular satisfaction in the praise, thinking instead of the pilots in her squadron who had not survived the treacherous flight through the debris field, and of the war that, despite this victory, still showed no clear sign of ending. General Khan, retreating deeper into Kryzeth territory, with the remnants of his shattered fleet, understood now, too late, exactly how badly he had miscalculated. He had believed humanity's century of peace had softened them into an easy target, exactly the kind of enemy his ancestors had wrongly assumed 107 years earlier. Instead, he had discovered, at devastating cost, that peace had not made humanity weak. It had simply given them time to grow stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to protect what they had built. The war was far from over. But for the first time since the attack on Solace Station, the balance had begun to shift decisively in humanity's favor, and within the halls of the Kryzeth Imperial Court, voices calling for an end to Khan's reckless campaign were growing louder with every passing day. In the months following the victory at Vantis Hold, human forces pushed steadily into Kryzeth territory, targeting the remaining Void Guard strongholds with the same careful precision that had defined the war since its opening strikes. Admiral Tanaka's fleet, reinforced by newly built ships from Earth's rapidly expanding wartime shipyards, systematically dismantled what remained of General Khan's military infrastructure, cutting off supply lines, disabling shipyards, and forcing Void Guard forces into a slow, grinding retreat toward the faction's remaining core territories. The campaign was not without cost. Every engagement brought casualties on both sides, and as human forces pushed deeper into contested space, the fighting grew harder, the Void Guard defenders more desperate and, in some cases, more willing to abandon the restraint that had characterized the early battles of the war. At a fortified outpost called Dren's Reach, Void Guard forces, facing certain defeat, chose to detonate the facility's reactor core, rather than surrender, killing not only the human boarding party attempting to take the station, but also several hundred Kryzeth civilians who had been sheltering there, workers and families, with no connection to the Void Guard faction's military ambitions. The tragedy at Dren's Reach weighed heavily on human command. General Reyes, reviewing the incident report alongside Admiral Tanaka, found himself troubled by more than simply the loss of human soldiers in the attack. He worried about what the escalating brutality of the fighting meant for the character of the war itself, and whether humanity's careful commitment to restraint could survive a conflict that seemed to be growing more desperate and more costly with every passing month. "We didn't start this to become like them," Reyes said quietly, during a private briefing with Tanaka aboard the Resolute Dawn. "But I worry that the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to remember why we're fighting at all, beyond simply wanting it to end." Tanaka understood his concern deeply. She had wrestled with similar doubts throughout the campaign, particularly after incidents like Dren's Reach, where the line between necessary military action and unnecessary tragedy grew difficult to see clearly amid the chaos of active combat. "We hold the line by remembering who we're fighting for," she said finally. "Not for revenge, for the people at Solace Station, who never got a chance to grow old. For every colony that trusted the peace to hold. If we lose sight of that, we've already lost something the Void Guard can't take from us with any weapon." Elena Voss, meanwhile, had spent the months since the attack working with a coalition of doctors and volunteers, rebuilding emergency medical infrastructure across New Meridian and several nearby colonies affected by the ongoing conflict. Her burned hands had healed slowly, leaving thin scars she would carry for the rest of her life, but she had returned to medical work almost as soon as she was physically able, driven by the same conviction that had guided her career from the beginning, that healing mattered, especially in the midst of war, perhaps more than at any other time. She followed news of the war closely, torn between relief at hearing of military victories that brought the conflict closer to an end, and quiet unease at the mounting casualty reports, human and Kryzeth alike, that accompanied every battle. She thought often of her father's speech before the council, the one that had helped tip the vote toward war, and wondered whether he ever second-guessed the role he had played in setting this course into motion. When she visited him during a brief return to Earth, she found him thinner than she remembered, worn down by the weight of watching a conflict he had helped start continue to claim lives on both sides. "Did I do the right thing?" Aldrich asked her one evening, sitting together in the quiet of his small home. "I told myself I was speaking for you, for everyone at Solace Station, but sometimes I wonder if I just wanted someone to pay for what happened to you." Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know if there's a clean answer to that, Dad. maybe it's both things at once. Maybe wanting justice and wanting the Imperium to answer for what they did aren't as separate as we'd like to believe. She paused, thinking of the patients she had treated since returning to medical work, human and Kryzeth alike, casualties of a war that showed both the necessity and the terrible cost of the choice her father had helped make. I just hope, whenever this ends, that it ends because it had to, not because we forgot why we started. Within the Kryzeth Imperial Court, the political situation continued deteriorating for General Khan and the Void Guard faction. Emperor Threxus Vol, facing mounting evidence of Khan's direct responsibility for the attack on Solace Station, and growing pressure from other factions within the Imperial Court, who blamed Khan's reckless ambitions for the devastating military losses the Imperium had suffered, finally moved to formally strip Khan of his command and military authority. The order came too late to prevent further bloodshed, but it marked a decisive turning point in the war's political dimension. Emperor Vol, addressing the Imperial Court in a rare public statement, formally acknowledged Void Guard responsibility for the attack on Solace Station, distancing the wider Imperium from Khan's actions and opening formal diplomatic channels with the Unified Human Council for the first time since the war began. The Void Guard faction acted without the sanction or approval of this Imperial Court, Vol declared, his statement broadcast across galactic news networks. Their actions brought grief upon thousands of innocent lives, human and Kryzeth alike, and shame upon the Imperium that permitted their ambitions to grow unchecked for too long. This court will not shield General Khan from the consequences of his actions, nor will it continue a war built upon his reckless miscalculations. The statement, while a significant political shift, did not immediately end the fighting. General Khan, stripped of his official authority but still commanding significant personal loyalty among hardline Void Guard officers who shared his views, refused to accept the Emperor's ruling. He retreated with his remaining loyal forces to a heavily fortified stronghold deep within contested territory, a system called Koresh Vantil, declaring that he would continue the fight against humanity, regardless of Imperial sanction, framing his continued resistance as a matter of Kryzeth honor, rather than simple military strategy. This declaration effectively split the Void Guard faction, with a significant portion of officers and soldiers choosing to abandon Khan's cause in favor of the Emperor's formal ruling, while a smaller, more radicalized core remained loyal to Khan himself, gathering at Koresh Vantil for what many observers, both human and Kryzeth, understood would likely be the war's final major battle. Admiral Tanaka received orders from Fleet Command to lead the assault on Koresh Vantil personally, a decision that weighed heavily on her, given everything the campaign had already cost. She spent several days in careful planning with her staff, determined to end the war as decisively and cleanly as possible, minimizing further casualties on both sides, while ensuring Khan's remaining forces could no longer pose a threat to any future peace. Captain Sarah Cade, promoted to commander following her actions at Vantis Hold, would once again lead a critical portion of the assault, this time targeting Khan's command infrastructure directly, in hopes of ending the resistance quickly, rather than allowing a prolonged, costly siege that would only add to the war's mounting toll. This should be the last one, Tanaka told her assembled officers during the final briefing before the assault on Koresh Vantil. Khan has lost everything, except the loyalty of soldiers, desperate enough to keep fighting a war their own emperor has already condemned. Our goal isn't destruction for its own sake. It's ending this, cleanly and finally, so we can all go home. The assembled officers nodded in solemn agreement, understanding the weight of what lay ahead. After months of grinding campaign across contested space, the war that had begun with an attack on a hospital and had cost thousands of lives on both sides since, was finally approaching what everyone hoped would be its conclusion. General Khan, meanwhile, prepared his forces at Koresh Vantil with the grim determination of a commander who understood, deep down, that he was fighting a battle he could not win, but refused to abandon regardless of the cost. He had spent his entire career believing in the superiority of Kryzeth's strength and the inevitability of reclaiming what his ancestors had lost a century earlier. Facing final defeat, he found himself unable to accept any outcome other than a final, desperate stand, whatever the consequences for the soldiers who remained loyal to him. As human forces approached Koresh Vantil, both sides understood, in different ways, that this battle would decide not only the outcome of the war itself, but the shape of whatever peace might eventually follow, and the question of whether that peace could prove any more lasting than the one that had shattered so violently at Solus Station many months before. The battle for Koresh Vantil began at dawn by the local star's cycle, though in the vacuum of space, such distinctions mattered little beyond tradition and habit. Admiral Tanaka's fleet approached the fortified stronghold with careful coordination, mindful of Fleet Command's clear instructions to end the engagement as quickly and cleanly as possible, minimizing casualties on both sides, even as they moved to finally dismantle General Khan's last remaining forces. Khan had fortified Koresh Vantil extensively during the weeks since Emperor Vol's formal condemnation, gathering every loyal soldier and ship willing to continue fighting under his command. It was, by any measure, a smaller force than the fleet he had commanded at Vantis Hold, but the soldiers who remained were among the most fanatically devoted to his cause, willing to fight to the last rather than accept what they saw as a humiliating surrender to human forces. Commander Sarah Cade led the assault on Khan's command infrastructure directly, guiding her strike group through Koresh Vantil's defensive perimeter with the same precision and coordination that had defined her role throughout the war. She had grown considerably as a commander since the early days of the conflict, carrying the weight of every pilot lost under her command during the treacherous flanking maneuver at Vantis Hold, and determined to bring this final battle to as swift and merciful a conclusion as circumstances would allow. The fighting at Koresh Vantil proved fierce, despite the numerical disadvantage facing Khan's forces. Soldiers fighting with nothing left to lose often fight harder than those with a clear path to survival, and Khan's remaining loyalists demonstrated exactly this grim determination throughout the engagement. Human forces sustained significant casualties pressing through the stronghold's defenses, but Tanaka's careful planning and Cade's precise strikes against key command and communication targets steadily eroded Khan's ability to coordinate an effective defense. 6 hours into the battle, with his defensive perimeter collapsing and his remaining ships suffering catastrophic losses, General Khan made a final, desperate decision. Rather than accepting defeat, he ordered his flagship, the battered but still functional Dread Providence, to attempt a direct ramming strike against Admiral Tanaka's command vessel, a final act of defiance that he believed might yet turn the tide of the battle, or, at minimum, ensure he would not survive to face the consequences of his actions. Commander Cade's strike group, positioned to intercept exactly this kind of desperate maneuver, engaged the Dread Providence. Before it could complete its attack run, in the intense engagement that followed, Khan's flagship sustained critical damage to its primary systems, disabling the vessel entirely before it could reach Tanaka's ship. Rather than allow his crew to die alongside him in a final futile gesture, Khan, faced with the reality of complete defeat, finally ordered what remained of his forces to stand down. The formal surrender came within the hour, transmitted from the crippled Dread Providence. To Admiral Tanaka's flagship, General Khan, humiliated and broken by the collapse of everything he had built his career and ambitions around, was taken into custody by human forces to be turned over to Kryzeth Imperial authorities for prosecution under both Imperial law and terms that would be negotiated as part of the war's formal conclusion. News of the victory at Koresh Vantil spread quickly across the galaxy, marking the effective end of major combat operations in the war that had begun with the attack on Solus Station nearly a year earlier. Emperor Vol, moving quickly to formalize peace before any further instability could take hold within the fractured Void Guard remnants, opened immediate negotiations with the Unified Human Council, eager to bring the costly conflict to a close. The negotiations that followed, conducted over several weeks at a neutral space station along the border between human and Kryzeth territory, proved complex but ultimately productive. Humanity, true to the character it had demonstrated throughout the war, did not seek territorial conquest or punitive reparations that might destabilize the wider Kryzeth Imperium and sow the seeds of future conflict. Instead, human negotiators, led by Speaker Amara Chen personally, focused on accountability and safeguards, formal prosecution of General Khan and his senior Void Guard officers for the attack on Solus Station, financial reparations directed specifically toward rebuilding the hospital and supporting survivors and families of the victims, and new treaty provisions establishing clearer, more robust mechanisms for addressing future tensions before they could escalate into open conflict. Emperor Vol agreed to these terms readily, recognizing that harsh punitive measures against the wider Imperium would likely breed the same kind of resentment that had allowed the Void Guard faction to grow in the first place. The new treaty, formally signed 6 weeks after the battle at Karesh Vantil, established what came to be known as the Solus Accords, a framework for galactic conflict resolution named deliberately after the hospital whose destruction had triggered the war, ensuring that its memory would serve as a permanent reminder of what failure to maintain peace could cost. General Marcus Reyes attended the signing ceremony as part of the human delegation, standing quietly near the back of the assembly as Speaker Chen and Emperor Vol formally signed the treaty documents. He thought of the old war he had fought as a young man, of the friends he had lost, of the promise he had made himself afterward to spend his life protecting the peace that conflict had won. He thought too of the vote in the council chamber nearly a year earlier, of Aldrich Voss's trembling speech about his injured daughter, and of his own words about peace being a promise that required defending, not simply hoping would hold on its own. Watching the treaty signing, Reyes felt a complicated mixture of relief and grief, the same feeling, he suspected, that most soldiers carried at the end of any war, however necessary or justified. The peace had been protected, but at a cost that could never be fully repaid, only honored through the commitment to make sure it lasted. Elena Voss returned to Solace Station for the first time since the attack on the day construction crews began rebuilding the hospital's main ward, funded in part by the reparations negotiated as part of the peace treaty. She walked through the skeleton of the new structure slowly, remembering the ward as it had been before the attack, filled with patients from a dozen different species receiving care, regardless of nation or history. Construction teams, human and Kryzeth workers laboring side by side as part of the treaty's reconciliation provisions, worked steadily around her, rebuilding what had been destroyed. She found herself standing near where the young Vakari boy's room had once been, the same room where she had smiled at him through the window on the morning of the attack, not knowing it would be the last ordinary morning for a very long time. She learned later that the boy had survived, his broken wing healing slowly over the months since the attack, and that he had written to the hospital staff, expressing his hope to visit the rebuilt station once construction was complete, wanting to see the place that had first shown him what kindness across species could look like, even in its darkest hour. The rebuilt Solace Station opened formally almost exactly 1 year after the original attack, its new main ward larger and more resilient than before, designed with input from engineers and architects representing a dozen different species who had contributed to its reconstruction as part of the peace agreement. A memorial wall stood at the station's entrance, engraved with the names of everyone who had died in the original attack, a permanent reminder of the cost that had led to the war and the peace that followed. Ambassador Threll Kaith attended the reopening ceremony as part of the Vakari delegation, reflecting on the words her grandmother had once shared about humanity's character in war. Watching Elena Voss speak at the ceremony, describing the hospital's renewed commitment to treating any patient, regardless of species or history, Threll understood more fully than ever why her grandmother had trusted humanity as an ally, rather than fearing them as a threat. Humanity fought fiercely when provoked, yes, but it fought to protect something worth protecting, and sought peace again the moment that protection was secured. General Khan, meanwhile, faced formal trial before Kryzeth Imperial Courts for his role in ordering the attack on Solace Station, ultimately convicted and sentenced to permanent exile from Imperial territory, a punishment that satisfied neither those who believed he deserved harsher consequences, nor those within the Imperium who still quietly sympathized with his hardline views. His conviction, however, served an important symbolic purpose, formally establishing accountability for the attack that had triggered the war and reinforcing the new treaty's core principle that such actions carried real consequences, regardless of the perpetrator's rank or standing. Standing at the reopening ceremony for Solace Station, watching the new memorial wall catch the light of the system's yellow sun, General Reyes reflected on the strange, difficult path that had led from that terrible attack to this moment of careful, hard-won renewal. Humanity had broken 107 years of peace to fight this war, a decision that had cost thousands of lives on both sides and tested everything the species believed about itself. But in the ending, In the deliberate restraint shown throughout the campaign, in the treaty that sought accountability rather than conquest, and in the rebuilt hospital standing once again as a symbol of care extended across every species and every history, Reyes saw something he believed was worth all that cost. Proof that humanity's peace had never been weakness, only patience, and that when that patience was finally broken, what emerged was not simple vengeance, but a fierce, disciplined determination to protect what mattered most, and to build something better once the fighting finally ended. The galaxy, watching humanity's war and its aftermath unfold over that difficult year, understood something new about the quiet, peaceful species that had lived among them for over a century. Humanity did not seek to rule, did not seek conquest, and did not fight without cause. But when the cause was clear, when innocent lives had been taken and a fundamental promise broken, humanity would answer, fiercely and completely, and would not stop until justice, however costly, had been served. And then, true to everything they had shown throughout the long century before that terrible attack, humanity would lay down its weapons once more and return to the quiet, patient work of building peace, one hospital, one treaty, one small act of care at a time.